This is Winchester Academy.
Preaching to the choir here. So this is Dale Evans and her horse Buttermilk. I do appreciate seeing some of you all dressed up in the spirit of the evening. I started this project because I was a fan. When I grew up, the Roy Rogers television show was playing in reruns on Saturday mornings, and I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. So this image to me was the most exotic thing I had ever seen. And I always remembered that. And as I kind of progressed through my academic career, I was always writing about American women. I was here a couple of years ago talking about women in World War II, and this time I decided to do a project that was more kind of for fun, because I get to do pop culture type stuff. So to me, Dale Evans seemed to be the best choice. There really isn't a good full-length biography just of her. Her name is always coupled with Roy Rogers, and I thought the time has come to just see what was going on with Dale. So what I want to do tonight is for some of you, some of these things might be a bit familiar, but there's a whole lot going on behind the scenes with Dale Evans, and I think a whole lot about her life that people never knew about because the publicity machines were not automatic back then. Now you want to know anything, you just click on the internet and you find all sorts of stuff. It was very easy to hide things when Dale was coming up in Hollywood, and she had her share of hiding things. So we'll talk about some of that, and I do have some clips. I'm a little wonky on getting all the technology to work, but I think I've got everything working. I do have my eye on the clock too, so I'll check that out as we go along. And I think the other thing most of you probably know about Dale Evans and Roy Rogers, if you know their horses, Buttermilk and Trigger, you probably know the song Happy Trails. How many of you know that Dale actually wrote this song? Okay, good. And she wrote it not for their television show. That's kind of a popular misconception. The song actually debuted on Roy's radio show, because for a number of years they were overlapping in different entertainment medium. They did movies, they did radio, and they did television, sometimes kind of all at the same time. So she wrote Happy Trails for his radio program, and then when they started their television program, that seemed to be kind of a no-brainer as their theme song. And one promise I'll make for you at the beginning of the evening: I will not sing to you. I'll leave that to the experts. And just as a reminder, it's not. Is that better?
Happy trails to you. Keep smiling until then. Happy trails to you till we meet again.
Okay, so that's the song we all know. Everybody likes to sing it as the credits rolled every week on their program. That's the song that everybody heard. The woman who wrote it, she's a Texas native. She was born in a little town called Uvalde, and you see it really is in the southern part of Texas. And she grew up, her name is actually a source of controversy. She does claim the name Frances Octavia Smith. Somewhere, though, on original birth documents, there's a name Lucille. Even her birth date is up for grabs, and ironically, not because of the year. And we all know celebrities tend to shave years off, but it was actually the date. Some documents say October 30, some say October 31st, and I think this goes back to the time period in the early 20th century where there were a lot of home births. This is the Smith family home as it looked as of last year. You can see the condition it was in. She was born at home. Her mother giving birth in her own parents' home. So this was Dale's grandparents' home, where she spent some of her time, especially summers, with her grandparents on the farm. Her family lived most of the time in Texas in another little town called Italy. And that was an endless source of confusion when I first started doing this research, too. I was trying to figure out how she got to Italy so quickly and why she wasn't speaking Italian, but it was, in fact, Italy, Texas. And her parents were, sort of average parents. Her father worked, he ran a hardware store in Italy. Her mother stayed at home. They had a very strong Christian background. Both of her parents were raised as Baptists, although for some reason, maybe this is what's referred to as a lapsed or slightly lapsed Baptist. They did allow dancing and singing in their home, and we can see where that led for Dale. But they did consider themselves to be fairly conservative Christians, and this was something that the young Frances rebelled against just about as soon as she could. When she was about 7 or 8 years old, the family moved from Texas to Arkansas. They moved to another kind of rural farming area called Osceola, and her father had decided to take up cotton farming for a while. And Frances actually liked it in Osceola. It was a bigger town. She went to a pretty nice school. She did Sunday school. She went to church. And she met boys. And when she was 14, and this is one of the few photographs I've been able to find of her as a very young woman. And so if you can kind of imagine her, and she loved current fashion, so the flapper dresses. She loved jazz music. She loved dancing the Charleston. And so when she was a teenager, this is what she was pursuing. She was playing musical instruments by this point. In high school, she played the piano. She played the ukulele. She sang. She already had decided by the time she was 14 years old that there were two things she wanted in her life. And these are things she pursued avidly. One was a career in something that would make her famous, and she figured it would be entertainment. But her first love always was, the one thing she never got to do, was be a star of the stage. She did envision her career being on Broadway, and that's the one thing she never got to do. But the other thing she was adamant about, and I think probably every woman in this room has experienced this kind of tension in their life, the pursuit of a career and the pursuit of a happy home with a husband and children. And this is what young Frances wanted. And when she was 14 years old, she was convinced she met the man of her dreams. A young man named Tom Fox. He was 18 years old at the time, and he drove a spiffy car, and he could Charleston really, really well. And Frances's parents tried to keep them apart. You all know how well that goes. She snuck around every chance she could get to see Tom until they eloped. She was 14 years old, and she eloped with her 18-year-old boyfriend. They eloped to his parents, found shelter there. His parents welcomed them. Frances finally called her parents because she realized they may worry, thinking that she was dead somewhere. So she called them, they begged her to come home, and she, of course, said no. She was in love. And the other thing, of course, anybody want to hazard a guess here? And here is where the documentation is really interesting, because in a subsequent divorce document, she claims that she and Tom Fox were married in February of 1927. The Arkansas state, or the county from the state that they were married in Arkansas, lists that date in April of 1927. And her only biological son was born that November. So she, by the time she's 15 years old, she has a baby. At that point, Tom Fox decides he's way too young to be married. So they're both terribly young, and they make bad decisions, or at least maybe Tom does. They were still living in Arkansas. Francis's mother had moved to Memphis, and it's an interesting family thing too. She left her husband, despite their devout Christianity. She left her husband for a while because he was a gambler, and she had another young child to take care of. So Francis's mother moves to Memphis. A few months after the baby is born, Tom Fox says to his wife, "Why don't you go visit your mother in Memphis?" And he arranges for Francis and their little baby, Tom Fox Jr., to go visit her mother and her younger brother. And while she's in Memphis, showing off her parenting skills to her mother, she gets a letter from her husband who says, "I want a divorce. We're too young. I just can't be married. I want a divorce." And at this point, Frances has some choices to make. And one of the choices, her mother did offer, "I'll adopt your baby, and we'll say that this is my son, and you can just go on being a teenager. You're 15 years old, you can go back and finish high school and, go on with the rest of your life." And Frances wouldn't do it, mostly because she thought Tom would come back to her. But also because she had a strong sense of herself as being able to do anything. So instead, she did live with her mother and her younger brother, and she went to secretarial school. Even though she wanted to be a star, she knew that nobody just becomes a star overnight. She knew she would have to work for it. And while she was working for it, she figured she'd be working for it doing something else. So she did what a lot of young women did in the 1920s. She got a degree in secretarial work, and she got an office job. And she stayed in Memphis with her mother, raising her son, and she gets a divorce from Tom Fox. He does come back to her, and he does ask her to come back. And she tells him no, because she has finally figured him out at this point. And she says no, she's not going to go back to him. So she gets divorced. The ink is barely dry on those divorce papers, and she's already out. She's a young woman. Okay? And the next young man, and I have never been able to find any surviving photographs of either Tom Fox Sr. or her second husband, August Johns. For a while in Memphis, Frances Fox was working at a new grocery chain that was starting in the 20s, Piggly Wiggly. She was working for Clarence Saunders as a secretary. It was one of the jobs. She had a few jobs, but at any rate, she meets this guy, August Johns. He was from Mississippi, and he was in the produce business, and they got married. So she's a very romantic young woman. But you also notice the date here. We're transitioning from 1929 to 1930. While she was working as a secretary in Memphis, she also did start to get into show business. As Frances Fox, she starts singing on one of the local Memphis radio stations. But this is not enough to earn a living. A lot of these radio shows, people were so happy to be on the radio, they just did it for free. And she would occasionally get paid a nominal amount, but she needed her day job. So she also kind of figured that she's not going to go too far in Memphis. And she gets married. August John says that and here the information gets a little sketchy. He apparently got some promotion to go work in North Dakota. And this is where the story just doesn't sound too good. But you also see the dates here. We're going from 1929 into 1930. And you all know what happened in 29, right? Okay. So the stock market crashes. And this is one of the reasons why Frances Fox figures that show business isn't going to go anywhere for her. Her radio gigs are drying up. Nobody can pay anything extra for singers. And it may be that John's got this job, this promotion. It was the best thing in 1930. The Depression was really settling in by that point. A lot of people were just miserable. But honestly, I can't think of anything more miserable than Frances Fox in Fairmont, North Dakota in 1930. And I think she didn't stay there for very long. She left her second husband. And here again, the information is a little bit sketchy. He apparently liked to drink, and he apparently was not happy about having somebody else's child in his household. He was not the kindest person. There were some charges, there were some later allegations about both spousal and child abuse. And again, you have to give Frances a lot of credit, because as soon as she saw what was happening, she picked up and she left. She left him. She first goes to Chicago. And she figures in a big city, she gets away from her husband, she can find work. She did find secretarial work. She could not break into any kind of show business in Chicago at all. She almost has a complete breakdown. And it is at this point more of a physical breakdown. She wasn't eating. She had her son with her. And she needed to make sure he was fed and clothed. She would often go without meals. Her mother came up. Her mother was back with her father at this point. They were living in Texas, but her mother would come up periodically to Chicago to help out with young Tommy. And finally, Frances just can't take any more. She packs up Chicago. She goes home to Texas. And she stays with her parents to recuperate for a little while. But she's still very young. And as soon as she recuperates, and again, the time frame here is a little squishy, but somewhere around 1934, and she's also still in touch with her second husband. I do know that during some of her time in Chicago, August Johns was in and out of the city, sometimes living with her, sometimes not. And at some point in 1934, he let her know he had relocated to Louisville. And she's recuperated at this point, and so she decides that she did pretty well in Memphis before the Depression set in. By 1934, she's thinking maybe things have turned around a little bit. Louisville is a little bit of a bigger market in terms of radio stations, so she figures she'll go there. So she takes her son, they move to Louisville. She does spend some time living with her second husband again, and this is where, at the same time, her second marriage totally falls apart. And, the divorce papers are filed. This is also when she is experiencing some of her earliest great successes. Once again, she had started off as a secretary in Louisville. This time she got a job at a radio station, so she was in a prime place there. Okay. So she's typing away, but everybody knows that she's got this really good singing voice, and she does then get a chance to sing on the radio. And the station manager loves her, but says that name's got to go. You try saying Frances Fox, and it doesn't really flow. Her original name, Frances Smith, is no better. She tries all sorts of trendy stage names, and then the station manager says, I've got it. I've got this great name, Dale Evans. And he's sold on it. She's not so much. But she decides it's short, it's easy, it's difficult for anybody to misspell. So that's when she becomes Dale Evans. But there's a little bit more to that story that I'll get into in just a minute, because it's I think not quite as simple as that. So she does pretty well in Louisville, enough that she's looking for a bigger market. Okay, Louisville was bigger than Memphis. Something's got to be bigger than Louisville, and she's still very concerned about her son. He doesn't thrive in Louisville, and she actually sends him back to Texas again. There had been, I think, a polio outbreak in Louisville, and she just was frantic to get her son out. So he goes back to stay with his grandparents in Texas. So Dale gets the idea, well, Dallas has got to be an even bigger market. And she, when she is performing on the radio, she is not the queen of the West at this point. She considers herself to be a popular singer, meaning she's singing the contemporary tunes of the time, and she likes all varieties of music, including Western and country songs, but she sings a lot of jazz. She loves jazz, as a matter of fact. So she figures Dallas will have a big market. So she moves back to Texas. She goes to Dallas, which is a very big city, and she does get hired by a Texas radio station called WFAA. And she is part of their morning show, and she has a named spot on it. She's a featured singer. Also, while she's in Dallas, she sings for a time with the Herman Waldman Orchestra, which I think even for people who are into big bands probably haven't heard of this. But it was a very well-known but regionally based big band, and it did tremendously well touring. It had quite a reputation, and she was thrilled to get a job with them, and she would sing with them. And she was joined in Dallas by a young man she had met back in Louisville. And I very recently found the only picture I have ever seen of the man who would become her third husband. So his name, okay, was Robert Dale Butts. Okay, so they worked together in Louisville. Okay, that's where they first met, and I don't think it's a coincidence that her station manager says, "Let's call you Dale." I think everybody in that station knew what was going on, that these two young people were falling in love, and the station manager probably figured, oh, wouldn't that be cute if they're both named Dale? Okay. And actually, Robert Dale did go by our Dale. Okay. And this picture was taken of them in Chicago, but he was there in Louisville. Dale Evans leaves Louisville first. She goes to Dallas. And she's not there for very long, and lo and behold, she gets a telephone call from our Dale, who says, work's drying up for me here too. I'm thinking about heading out to California, but I thought I'd stop in Texas on my way out. So Dale says, sure, there's plenty of work here in Dallas, and he gets a job at the same radio station with her, and he was very well known. If you do an IMDb search under his name, he scored movies. And so he was a pianist and an arranger. So he follows her to Dallas, and they get married, because this is what Dale Evans does. She gets married. So now in the late 1930s, she is on husband number 3, who will last longer than the previous ones. And they apparently did have a very good marriage. And here you see them walking down, and they decide after they're done in Dallas, after they conquer that market, and she's done well in radio, she's done well with a big band, but she's still irritated with Chicago, okay, because that's the city that almost broke her. And so now that she's got our Dale with her, she thinks she can, and together they can crack that market. So they moved to Chicago in the late 1930s. I mean, this is just an adorable photo, isn't it? They look like the classic cute couple, and they did. They got along very well, and it was very different for her in Chicago this next time. They move to Chicago. They take Tommy with them. And as soon as they get there, they both start applying for jobs. She gets sent out on auditions right away. I mean, unlike back in the early 30s where she couldn't get anybody to listen to her, she is getting auditions all the time. And it's the same kind of combination that she had in Louisville. She starts with a radio station. She's on WBBM in Chicago, and she's again a featured player on a morning show. And she also gets a gig with a big band from the era, Anson Weeks. He had more of a national reputation. In the 30s and 40s, everybody said, let's go dancing with Anson. So he was very well known, and she not only sang with him in Chicago, but she sang with him when he was out touring. She did do some tours as well. So here, and this is a very old recording. It's the only one that's known to exist of her with the Anson Weeks Orchestra, and I have to do some clumsy stuff here, so sorry. Uh-oh. Oh, shoot. That's not the one I wanted. It's really clumsy, sorry. And it could be, 2 days ago when I was listening to this, it could have been taken down since then. Talk about that. Oh, we heard that one before. So that's an example of some of her earlier singing, and I think one of the things that you kind of notice from some of the other photos that were up there, and I wanted to go back to a couple of these early sort of publicity shots of her, you can see the kind of career she saw for herself, that she was this very sophisticated sort of nightclub singer. And one of the things that she did do very well with in Chicago was getting engagements at some of these kind of swanky hotel ballroom type places. And the pinnacle of her career there was when she got booked at this place called the Chez Paris. And this was a place that booked nationally known acts. And when she appeared there, I mean, her name was in tiny, tiny letters along with lots of other people, but she was thrilled. Okay? And this was in 1940, and she thought, finally, and think about this, since the late 20s, she's been plugging away at this career. So finally in 1940, she thinks, I'm at the Chez Paris. Okay? And appearing at the same time was a song and dance man named Ray Bolger. Okay, and he was just off of that great role in The Wizard of Oz. Okay, everybody knew him from that, and Dale Evans was absolutely thrilled to find that he was. I mean, they weren't supposed to appear on the same stage together, but they were booked at the same time. And one night, he stopped by her dressing room to say hello to her, and she was, she was beyond thrilled. And he offered her some advice. We mentioned this with Happy Trails. That was not the only song she wrote. Dale Evans has some 200 song titles to her name. She was a prolific songwriter. And a song she was working on in 1940, because it was leap year, and you all know about leap year, that's the year that women are entitled to propose to men. So she'd been working on this song called Will You Marry Me, Mr. Laramie? And she tried it out at the Chez Paris, and it was, the way she did it was kind of a come hither type song, will you marry me? And Ray Bolger had watched her act, and he said, you've got a great voice, you've got a great ear for song lyrics, but he said, you can't do a bawdy lyric. He said, you're not the type. You can't do it. And again, if you think about that for a minute, on the one hand, that had to have been kind of a crushing assessment, because she's still a very young woman. She's got this great voice. She looks really good. And here, Ray Bolger is telling her, you can't do that. So he gives her a suggestion. He says, go home, work on the lyrics a little bit more to make it kind of funny. And he said, if you do that, I'll go on stage with you, and I'll be your Mr. Laramie. Okay. So he does. And I mean, not that they do this very long, but it's enough where the Chez Paris likes her well enough. She gets her contract extended by another couple of weeks or something. And they are a hit with the audience, because she's singing this song to him, and this is not from that. That's just something else. But, he's being goofy Ray Bolger, and, being all astonished that this lovely young woman would be interested in him. And it goes over really well with the audience. And so she is still appearing on radio. She's still trying to get her name out there. And with this appearance with Ray Bolger, that does finally tip everything. And she gets a call from a Hollywood agent. And remember, though, this is not what she has envisioned. She's looking at the other coast. She's thinking she's going to get tapped from Broadway. She's thinking she's working the stages in Chicago, then she'll go to New York. But she gets a call instead from a Hollywood agent who says, why don't you come out here and do a test, and I think I've got something for you. So she spends the money on having, and I've checked out this photographer. He was a big deal in Chicago, and she goes and she has these studio portraits done, good headshots for when she goes to Hollywood. So she spends some money on this, and her husband Ardale is completely behind this. He was the co-writer on the Mr. Laramie thing, and he thinks this is great. So he encourages her. So late 1940s, she's getting ready, and she gets to Hollywood in early 1941. And her agent did have her in mind for a particular role. She was supposed to, she had a screen test because there was this movie called Holiday Inn that was casting. And Fred Astaire and Bing Crosby were still looking for some female leads. And this agent who called her had heard one of her radio programs, loved her voice, and would listen to her, make a point of listening to that show every week. Loved her voice, loved her voice. But again, this is pre-internet days. So, he didn't really know anything about this Dale Evans. Doesn't really know what she looks like. So she gets to Hollywood. She actually flies there, which is a big deal in early 1941. She flies there, and she doesn't do very well on the plane. And remember, at this point, she's not an ingenue. She's in her late 20s. She gets off the plane. The agent takes one look at her and says, "You're Dale Evans?" And she's horrified. And he says, "How old are you?" And she tells him the truth. She says, "I'm 28. He says, "You're 21. And he's also horrified to find out that she's married and that she has a teenage son. And she says, and he tells her, "That's not your son, that's your brother." And that was a fiction she carried until the late 1940s. She passed off her son as her younger brother in Hollywood. So all of this is developing very rapidly as this agent, in her first day in Hollywood, she goes in for a complete makeover. She has to have her hair redone. I mean, she looks sophisticated for Chicago. She looks like fish out of water in Hollywood. So she has to be all redone. And she sits down with the guy who's doing the hiring for Holiday Inn. She sits down with him and her agent, and this guy, the casting guy, starts talking to her about her dancing abilities, because she's got to be up there hoofing with Fred Astaire. And her agent says, "Oh, don't worry, she can dance." And Dale Evans says, "I cannot dance. I don't, beyond doing, just regular stuff that you can do." She says, "I can't dance with Fred Astaire." So that doesn't go very well. And she does the screen test, and the studio passes on her, and she, in fact, can't, she's not equipped to do Holiday Inn. She's got a nice voice. And one of the things that she'll be hearing from other casting agents, and especially her early years in Hollywood, is that, yes, she looks nice, she's got a great voice, but she's too much like Betty Grable. And we already have a Betty Grable, and we don't need another one. But I don't think Betty Grable was known for her singing, so I'm not quite sure why that comparison was. But it's not a complete bust. She does get signed on. She does get a year-long contract with 20th Century Fox. And Fox is willing to test her out in some movies, and she starts very slowly. Um, this movie, Orchestra Wives from 1942, which was actually a very popular movie. I mean, this is 20th Century Fox, and this is about Glenn Miller's orchestra and the women, so Orchestra Wives. And she wasn't one of the wives. Dale Evans has this very, very brief speaking part in the movie. She's a girl at the soda fountain. And that's how she starts off at 20th Century Fox. And in this year-long contract, she doesn't get any further than that. She has these really, really small parts, barely a few lines, and Fox just doesn't know what to do with her. But she does spend her time, when she's not filming for Fox, doing other things. This is already 1942. Nobody's talking about the Depression anymore, but everybody is talking about the war. Okay. So she does what a lot of Hollywood people do. She spends her spare time entertaining the troops. And she does this all stateside. Dale Evans was not one of the entertainers who went overseas to entertain. She spent a lot of time up and down the coast in California performing in a variety of these shows. And incidentally, one of the people she meets backstage at this point is a cowboy named Roy Rogers, who's there with his group, the Sons of the Pioneers. And she's like, oh yeah, hi, hi, hi. But not terribly interested in him. But they do cross paths a few times before they work together later. And again, this is rare footage, and let's see what I can do here.
So up from the film town comes a double load of names that give us a show on the spot. Danny Kaye, Dick Powell, Dale Evans, Yvonne DiCarlo, and a whole flock of others. For most of them, this was their first time on a flat top, and they were like a small-town gang taking their first look at the big city.
Look at the fur coats,
The commander shows them around, including a
in California.
that proved that we hadn't been out trolling.
I think that must have been Northern California.
Down below on the hangar deck, while the flight deck was still crawling with welders, riveters, and repairmen, we got a welcome home show that did more for us than a double dose of vitamins. Here's some samples of what went on. Dick Powell opened the show. Then Powell brought on something you'd dream about, but you couldn't find on a hangar deck once in 10 years. Yvonne DiCarlo.
And this is not the Babalu we all know, right? We're thinking Desi. Where's Desi Arnaz?
Personal log, Dale Evans. Oh man, how that little lady wrapped us up.
I care for IQ, 'cause in the duties that I give him, there'll be darn little brain work to do. As long as it's the
So she has a 1-year contract with 20th Century Fox. The year's up. They decline to renew. So she thinks maybe she's out of Hollywood. So she goes back to one of the other things she knows best, radio. And she gets a job in 1942 with a very popular show that ran on NBC radio called the Chase and Sanborn Hour. And some of you, I think, probably recognize who the big stars were of that show. But that's Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Which one is the dummy, of course, was the running joke for the duo. But she was a featured player for a year on that show. And she had numbers all the time. I mean, she was a named singer on that show. And again, it seemed like this was going to be it. This was going to be, the movie stuff had fizzled out. Here she's on national radio. She gets a call from one of the advertisers for the show, who wants to invite her out to come out to New York to have lunch with him. And she declines, and she gets fired. So we know the way that Hollywood has worked for a long time, and Dale Evans got caught up in that in the 1940s. So she lost her job with the Chase and Sanborn Hour because she was not willing to pay that kind of price to keep it. But again, she never gives up. Okay? So she figures, okay, radio is gone for a while. And this time it does work out better with movies. Okay? But instead of a big movie theater like 20th Century Fox, which was known for big budget films, the kinds of things that she envisioned, because now she figures she's not on Broadway, but still she sees herself in one of those big budget Hollywood musicals. Okay? But instead, the studio that pursues her, that really wants her and says, we can put you to work right away and we will keep you working in pictures like every day, is a small studio called Republic. And it was known for creating what are called B films. Those were those were the ones that came on before or after the feature film. They almost always were in, well, I think they always were in black and white. And you could kind of tell that the sets were not quite as nice. The costuming was not quite as nice. But they were meant just to be kind of fun. They were either serials or they were comedies. And the head of the studio, Herbert Yates, had Dale Evans in mind for sort of musical comedy type shows. And he was true to his word. Okay? As soon as she signed that contract, she was put to work. And she has movies coming out almost right away. And these are, I mean, they're low budget. They're designed to be kind of fluffy and fun. And she gets to act and she gets to sing in just about every film. And I think I'm going to save my clip time for a couple of other things. But, and again, the wonders of YouTube. You can actually find, I was watching Swing Your Partner again the other night, you can actually find the full-length thing there. And I mean, the plots are simplistic. In Swing Your Partner, she's the secretary for a cheese company. And the female owner of the cheese company gets mad because her employees are saying nasty things about her, so she and Dale go undercover in the cheese factory to find out who was saying bad things. And of course Dale falls, and in this movie, Swing Your Partner, they don't even bother to give her a different name. In the show, in the movie, her name is Dale Evans. So I mean, these are the kinds of things that happen in Republic Pictures. But she actually, she did very well there. She was cast in movies, but not, I mean, and even in Republic movies, there was kind of a higher tier. They had their own features, and she was trying to get into those. And Herbert Yates kept saying, yeah, you'll get there, just wait a little bit longer. And she got really excited in 1943, when the head of the studio goes off to Broadway to see this musical that's been taking everybody by storm called Oklahoma. Okay. And Dale Evans thinks, if Herbert Yates loves Oklahoma, and if he wants to do something like that at Republic, she thinks, okay, this is it. This is me. Okay. So he comes back, and he wants to do a musical Western. He wants to capitalize on all of that publicity from Oklahoma. And Dale thinks, okay, this is going to be my big break. And he tells her that he wants her to, and it's not really even a co-starring role, because this was the other thing that was a fact of her life from 1944 on, that her billing was always below Trigger's. Okay. So it's Roy Rogers, his horse Trigger, and then you see even in this one there's another female actress who is above her. So she's, and the first time Herbert Yates says to her, I want to pair you with Roy Rogers, she tells her agent, I don't want to do this. And her agent says, no, I agree. This is not the career move we want. And they managed to hold him off for a little while, and finally they can't anymore. He insists that she work with Roy Rogers. And you know, and it's kind of a calamity from the start, because they figure, oh, she was born in Texas. You know, she knows horses. You know, Roy Rogers had to teach her how to ride a horse. She had some trouble the first few times. I think there was problems with her new teeth getting banged up, and I mean, just it was bad. But she was a real trooper, and she stuck with it. So The Cowboy and the Senorita, which came out in 1944, was the first of over 20 films they would make together. And for some reason, audiences just love them together. And again, it's by our standards of movies today, it may be kind of hard to see why. So I do want to show you a little bit from this. And again, a lot of these plots are all basically the same. There's some wrong that needs to be righted, and Roy Rogers is usually there to right that wrong, and Dale Evans helps him out. Sometimes she's part of the problem and part of the solution. And the interesting thing about The Cowboy and the Senorita is that the character that Dale Evans plays is a Hispanic woman. Her name is Isabel Martinez, and she in some scenes wears, you know, these really interesting costumes, and she tries to speak with a Spanish accent. That doesn't really go very well. So this one, I also have to try to YouTube it here.
You've got us all wrong. We picked it up on the trail just outside of town.
Uh-oh.
Save the rest of it for the sheriff. That was a cute idea, trying to join the posse to fool us.
Sheriff's down at the Martinez Ranch.
Telephone him to wait there. We'll take this pair with us.
I'll phone him for you.
Bring him outside.
Come on.
Don't be so familiar.
Hello, Fuzzy. Has the sheriff gotten here yet?
Yeah, he's over at the corral now getting some fresh horses.
Well, tell him we've captured the kidnappers.
Kidnappers?
Yeah.
Jump in captives.
Come on in.
Got some news for you, Isabel.
You found her?
No, but we picked up some men who know something about this.
Are these the two suspects, Mr. Allen?
That's right. They tipped their hand down at my club, Sheriff. Take a good look at these men, Isabel. Have you ever seen them before?
No.
Are you sure?
Positive. Did you take Chip away? Please tell me the truth.
I am telling the truth, Miss Martinez. I haven't even seen the child. Neither is my pal. I wish I could help you, though.
So do I.
For some reason, I believe you. What makes you think they're lying, Craig?
Because we found this on them.
I told you I picked that up out on the trail.
You keep out of this.
Please, Craig. You're strangers around here, aren't you?
That's right. We were looking for work until we heard about Chip, then we offered to join the search.
Sure. We'd still like a crack at it. These pals of yours are cramping our style. Do I look like a kidnapper?
Oh, you look better than that. So big and strong. He has honest eyes, Miss Martinez.
Say, Lulu Bill, what's the idea of sparking this big bandit? I'll have you understand you're talking to the woman I love. Take it easy, Short Stack. She's safe till I turn on the charm.
Let's break this up. After they've defrosted in that jail, they'll talk, I guarantee you.
In jail? Did you think you pushed us around enough, Mr. Allen? I've told you the whole story. What else do you want to know?
So that was their first movie together, and it did very well. We'll get back to that. So this is when her career really takes off, and her marriage also falls apart. She's still married to Ardale. Like I said, the marriage was a very happy one, but he was also working at the movie studio doing scoring. Their hours didn't really mesh. They didn't see each other very much, and so they kind of drifted apart, and they decided to get a divorce. It was very amicable. I've read through his papers at UCLA. He spoke very highly of her. And in fact, after their divorce, he worked on some of the movies she did with Roy Rogers. I mean, they all got along together. And Roy was on I think his second or third marriage, but his wife died in 1946, shortly after giving birth to their son. So Dale Evans was also at kind of a crossroads here. She was trying to get away from Republic and all of these pictures with Roy Rogers. She tries to go out on her own to do something else. It doesn't work. She talks again with Roy about these things. After his wife died, they started seeing each other, and finally he proposed. They were doing a rodeo together, and they're getting ready to ride out into this arena, and he just looks at her and says, "What are you doing New Year's Eve?" And she said, "Nothing." And he said, "Let's get married." And she said, "Okay." And so again, yeah, it's what she does, but think about the complications here. Roy has a pretty brand new baby, and also two adopted daughters. Or no, there was one daughter that he had with his wife, and then there was an adopted daughter. So he has 3 children. And her son Tommy at this point, Dale's son Tommy, is a young man really. He's pretty much on his own. And this is when his true story starts to come out. One of the big gossip columnists gets the dirt on the story and makes a big reveal right as the news of their wedding is circulating. And there's some concern that this will do in her career. You know, that she was this lying woman all along who was hiding her son. And actually her fans didn't seem to care. They were like, well, you know, what would you expect her to do under these circumstances? They didn't really, they saw it as a non-issue. Although the head of Republic Studios, he didn't really care about the son thing. He knew about that. He cared very much that Roy and Dale got married without his say-so. Because he saw it in terms of public relations, and he saw Roy Rogers as very valuable as the grieving widower. And for him to be married so quickly and to marry his co-star, and Dale gets suspended. She gets suspended from the studio for about a year. She doesn't work. And here's a picture of the family. all together as it stood without Dale's son, but this is the three young children. And she's devoted from the very beginning that she's going to make this family work. She's always wanted a family. She gets one ready-made now. She's determined to make it work. She's out of work. She's out of the studio. So she throws herself into domestic chores. And wouldn't you know, this is the one time her agent gets a call from a theater in London that is mounting a production of Annie, Get Your Gun. And they want her to come and do it, and she turns them down because she wants to stay with her new family. And as it turns out, of course, yeah, and this, I'm getting the time signal, and this is where we kind of know the familiar part of the story. She stays. Both of their times with Republic Pictures were really at an end. This is when television is starting to become very big business, and Roy and Dale are planning together for a television show. They are one of the first Westerns on TV. They're very successful. But one thing that I think most people don't know too much about is that Roy and Dale did have, very briefly, a daughter of their own. So while all of this stuff is happening with their personal and professional lives, they're getting out of Republic, they're starting their new TV series, Dale finds out she's pregnant. She's in her late 30s. And, there's not the kind of prenatal care that we have now. And they're both very surprised when their daughter is born and diagnosed with Down syndrome. And she had a lot of physical problems as well, especially heart problems. Robin only lived for about 2 years. And Dale wrote a book called Angel Unaware. And this is where we really see the Christian part of her life come back again. And she launches another concurrent career. She becomes this best-selling author. She writes I think close to 24 Christian faith-based books, starting with Angel Unaware. And the Rogerses were really the first well-known family to keep a Down syndrome child in their home. The doctors told them, institutionalize her. And Dale said, no. She is our daughter. And they took her home and they cared for her for 2 years. They hired nurses, of course, but they had her at home. And they did allow publicity shots. When there were family shots, Robin was there. She was a part of the family. And Dale insisted that everybody know this. The family started a foundation for children. Roy and Dale went on to adopt several more children. They lost more children. 2 of their adopted children died tragic deaths. One was an alcohol poisoning, and one was a bus accident on the way back from a church mission trip. So they had their share of sorrows, but through it all, they were an immensely effective professional team. Their television show ran from 1951 to 1957. It was, if not always at the top of the charts, it was a steady producer for NBC. They were mega merchandisers. Some of you may remember the Roy Rogers and Dale Evans lunch boxes and cowgirl and cowboy outfits. They were marketing geniuses with all of this. And I keep saying one final thing, but this really will be the last thing. Dale stayed active just about until the day she died. She had, and probably another thing most people don't know, she had a long-running talk show on the Trinity Broadcasting Network, which was a Christian, or still is a Christian cable channel. It's called A Date with Dale, 30 minutes, interviewing people, talking about Christian faith, and that ran from '84 to the year before she died. Even with all of her health problems, her age, she continued to be on screen, to bring that message, that wholesome message of Christianity, coupled with what she saw as the strengths of the West for the United States. Okay, so I'm sorry I ran over there.